In fact, we're going to go faster than we did last week. It's kind of tricky. We were doing 3 weeks to cover one chapter, so it's hard to know how far to get. And I hope you enjoyed last week, but we didn't get too far. So we're going to pick the pace up a little bit. But here are some of the things that we're covering, and we're going to move on from the fact that the culture is eager to test us. Not a shock exactly, is it, when you see how quick people are now to criticize Christianity. And the interesting thing to me is how much evidence is on the side of Christianity. At least it says, during the time of Caesar Augustus, this happened. During the time of somebody in this community, in this city, in this area of the country. I mean, it is so rooted in places, and it's so rooted with people, and it's so rooted with manuscript evidence. You can't put any other religion up against Christianity and have that kind of evidence. It's all total faith-based in many cases. Steve mentioned last week the Book of Mormon has zip as far as archaeological support, nothing. So Christianity is way ahead of these others. The other thing that I thought was interesting is, this is coming from J. Warner Wallace. He talks about using circumstantial evidence. When we're talking to other people, we're going to be using circumstantial evidence, because the only other kind is called direct evidence, and those are eyewitnesses. They've been dead 2,000 years, so you can't do that. But it's no different than what Wallace has done for his whole career as a cold case detective. He's been dealing with no eyewitnesses. They're all gone or never were around in the first place, and he still gets convictions. We're talking about death penalty convictions. He can still get convictions based on circumstantial evidence. He said it drives him crazy when people said, well, that's just circumstantial evidence. He said, don't put the word just in front of that. He said, when you're in a court, the judge is going to say, to the jury, you must regard circumstantial evidence as no weaker or no less than eyewitness testimony. So what are we going to do here in this class, and I hope the rest of your lives as you work with Christian apologetics, you're going to be accumulating circumstantial evidence. And the idea is you accumulate, you pile this stuff up, and maybe one argument doesn't really convince many people, but you say, well, there's this, and there's this, and there's this, and there's this, and it starts building up. So that's what we're hoping for. Maybe one piece is not a knockout, but you keep coming up with more and more evidences, and you'll see how that's going to work a little bit later tonight. So we're going to be putting those pieces of evidence together. I'm not going to spend much time on this. There are 3 things I want to spend a little bit more time on, if that's okay. But this is a set of the questions that went out to you. And by the way, now Steve will be starting next week. I'll send you Chapter 2 questions if Steve wants. I don't know if he's going to use my questions or he's got his own, but we'll get you information this week for the next 3 weeks. Okay, so it's 3 weeks for me, 3 weeks for Steve, and back and forth again. So here are 2 pieces of I thought were pretty interesting questions. If we're relying on evidence, and that's what we were talking about. Christianity is an evidence-based religion. Some people get a little nervous with that, and they say, well, if we're relying on evidence, you've got no room for faith. So I thought we're supposed to be people of faith, and Hebrews talks about characters of faith from the Old Testament. By faith, so-and-so did something. By faith, somebody else did something. So where do we stand on that as Christians? Are we saying we're tossing faith out the window? It's all evidence? What are your thoughts on that? Faith is based on the evidence. Did you guys hear that? Faith is based on the evidence. I wish we got rid of the word faith. I'd like to replace it with trust. You don't have just blind faith that this chair will hold you. You have trust. You haven't seen one of these chairs collapse, and we've met here, and we've met here, and we've met here. So you guys sit down with great ease, far more than just blind faith. You have trust. Linda? Oh, that could be. Yeah, especially when you're a little kid. Jesus loves me, this I know, for the Bible tells me so. Do you have any evidence at that stage? Probably not, but it'll come. That's a good point. Jim?
On the other side, we have the evidence, and what are you going to do about it? That's your faith that built on that evidence.
Yeah, that's true. Alan?
Well, the other part is we have all this evidence that Jesus is here and these things happen, and we trust that he's going to keep his word and he will judge.
Yeah. That's true. Yeah. Sorry, help me with names again. Chairman.
There are certain things that we will come across in the Bible that we disprove.
Yeah.
But the evidence to support those is based upon the body of the Word. We are not going to how so many different authors all come to the same conclusion and not repeat each other.
Yeah.
Unless the source is true.
Yeah, I'm with you. You just mentioned something interesting. We cannot really prove to 100% satisfaction that there is a God. However, the atheist cannot prove to 100% satisfaction that there is no God. So we have to get the best evidence we can and see where it lines up. And I think it lines up really strongly on Christianity. But we're not going to go out like mathematics. You can prove certain things in mathematics. You can't prove them when it comes to these big issues of life. What does it mean to live a life? What happens to you when you die? What's the right way to conduct yourself? You can't prove these things. So you're still going to have to use some faith. But I think it takes a whole lot less faith, in the words of Frank Turek and Norm Geisler. It takes more faith to be an atheist than to be a Christian. If you're an atheist, you have to believe something came into existence from nothing, the universe. Life came from non-life. Morality came from molecules. Consciousness came from dirt. That's all that stuff. You start piling that up. That's a lot of faith to say all of that came about just randomly. The world is tilted just right. We're in the right spot in the solar system. We got the right kind of sun. All that stuff just happened. That takes a whole lot more faith. What about this? Why should we make the case going out in the world? Why should we make the case when God's the one, and we talked about this the first week, that we don't believe as people going out and talking to others that we're the ones that save anybody. That's up to God. So we're all in agreement there. Well, if that's the case, why are we going out and making the case if it's up to God? Why don't we just sit back and pray about it? God's all powerful. He'll save them. What's that? Somebody said something? He told us to. Yeah. Sure. Yeah, that was a commandment, wasn't it? Go therefore and preach this thing. So don't you think it helps us? Yeah, I mean, God could do it all, but then we're sitting back doing nothing. Doesn't that kind of build us up? I'm sure Steve's seen that when he worked with those high school kids. I bet they were better kids for having gone out and talked to those atheists. I bet, or the Mormons or whoever it was. I bet they gained a lot of confidence and knowledge, and I bet that's going to be applicable for other places in their lives. Dan?
Well, I think the Bible says, too, that, I forget who it was, but he said watch out for, several times probably, watch out for the false prophets out there. I think people are so easily led astray, and God's put us out there to bring them back.
Yeah.
God certainly said it's not right for man to be alone.
Yeah.
So he put us together for a purpose, and that I think brought
Sure.
purpose.
I don't know if you remember the little illustration that Wallace used in chapter 1. He said his son hates mushrooms. So you're laughing. So he said, you know, if he had the magic wand, he'd take away that fear of mushrooms, and then the kid could explore whether he really wanted to eat those mushrooms or not. And he said God, in a sense, is kind of like that. He takes away that enmity that we have, and then we go out and we talk to people, we clear the brush, and then we present Jesus. And now they figure out who Jesus is. Now they can make a better decision. They've been angry, and they've been, you know, their heart's been held captive and all, and God releases that, and in a sense allows that person then to make a far clearer judgment. That's where we come in, present some of that information to them. Yes?
The reason why we need to make a case, even though God is in it, is because we would destroy the very foundation of what He created us in the first place. God created us to live well. We cannot do that if we do not exude His presence.
That's a good point. It says we're God's ambassadors. So we are going to a new country. We're going, in this sense, to the secular world, and we're to be ambassadors. And what's an ambassador for? Not to sit up in a air-conditioned suite someplace, although probably someone will do that. You're supposed to go out. You're supposed to meet the people there. You're supposed to figure out what the culture is. You're supposed to try to make your society look okay in their eyes. And so you clear away the confusion they may have about the United States and say, no, it's not really like that. This is what it's like. Oh, okay, that makes more sense. So we're ambassadors. We're supposed to carry the message. Let's do this. Let's spend more time on these questions coming up, because to me this is the real heart of what he was getting across in the first chapter. He was challenging us in 3 areas. And so some of you are pros. You've been down this path before and you got the answers. You would know immediately. But he asked questions I think are really challenging. And so Do you see my note up here? There's going to be 3 topics. The truth of Christianity. In other words, somebody says to you, I don't know why I'd bother being a Christian. I'm not sure any of it's true. And you say, yeah, it is. And you list some evidence. So we're going to talk about that in a minute. The reliability of the New Testament. Many people, thanks to Bart Ehrman, unfortunately, and some others, are out telling you, don't trust the New Testament. It was written hundreds of years later. He's got a book out called Forged. That gives you an idea. And so the New Testament's come under probably more attack recently. Da Vinci Code went after it, if you remember that. And then the third thing is the resurrection of Jesus. So all we can do tonight, because we got to keep moving. Steve's got 3 weeks coming up. And so just think of every apologetics class that we do is nothing but just an introduction. It's just cracking the door open a little bit, and you can kind of peek inside going, there's a lot of stuff in there. So here's the deal. If you would like to get more of that information fast rather than wait for another set of apologetics classes, I put out a book called The Case for Christianity. And I'll give it to you free if you want to email me. And it covers the kinds of things that we're going to talk about tonight. Let me just give you an idea of some of the topics that are in here. I won't do all of them, but so you get a PDF. You don't get the hard copy. Unless you want it, I'll sell that to you. But it's like $5. I'll do it if you want. But you can get your own free copy. I'll just send it to you. Just email me and I'll send you a copy. Okay, so Basics of the Faith, an Introduction to Apologetics. Remember the first night I did about 15 minutes of that, and that was it. So if you want to see the whole thing, it's here. It's just in the text here. Arguments for the existence of God, the Trinity, the uniqueness of Jesus, the resurrection of Jesus. Can we trust the Gospels? Other religions, Jehovah's Witnesses, Mormonism, Islam, science and history. Can you trust, et cetera, et cetera. Social issues, tolerance, homosexuality, same-sex marriage, the existence of the soul. So if you'd like this, it's not a requirement or anything, but if you just feel like, boy, I'd like to get more of these foundations, they're just kind of teasing me with some of these topics. So email me and I'll be glad to send that to you. So let's start in. Some of you are brand new to this, and that's fine. I'm glad you're here. And so some of this may seem deep or going over it too fast or something. That's why you can take a look at other videos we have, or you can pick up that book or something. But Wallace says, can you make an argument for the truth of Christianity? So I made a list here, and maybe you can think of other things on the list. If you were talking to somebody that says, I don't know, one religion is pretty much the same as any other religion, why should I be, in this case, why should I be a Christian? So which of these strike you as ones that you would have come up with? Which ones seem the most obvious to you that you'd probably be able to talk to somebody about? Which one? Number 2? The existence of God? Okay, well, let's start there. And again, we're just going to spend a minute on it. But what would you say? How do you convince somebody there's even a God? A lot of people today are saying, nah, I don't think so. Well, you can't have Christianity if you don't have a God. What?
I'm here.
You're here. Okay, so the fact of what? That we're here? Yeah, this universe shouldn't have life in it. I mean, how do you get life? Everything has to be fine-tuned for life. Somebody once said if you took gravity and just made gravity a little bit more, a little stronger, you couldn't get the universe to exist. It'd all sit in one big clump of stuff. But if you made it a little bit weaker, the stuff would fly apart, and you wouldn't get planets, you wouldn't get us. So somebody figured it out one time. They said if you stretched a tape measure across the entire universe, this is from, I think, one of Strobel's books. If you know that? If you stretched a tape measure, and that tape measure was what gravity would be wherever it fell on the line there. If you move that measurement 1 inch out of the whole universe, in other words, the dial for gravity is set in such a way you move it 1 inch, you don't get life. 1 inch out of the universe. So, I mean, that's pretty wild. We're here. That's a terrific argument for the existence of God. Anything else that you'd use, Dan?
I think the Hubble telescope is a good example that people have all heard of, and they know what it does and everything. And so that took pictures of the universe, and it proved, I think, that the universe is expanding. And so if the universe is expanding, you go backwards, and you say, well, that means the universe has started at some point. And that means that's the original starting point. And in order for somebody to create that, they had to be outside of space, time, and matter. So that shows that there must have been an intelligent designer.
So something outside of nature is called supernatural. You're off to a supernatural start. They have been banging their heads against the wall, people that didn't want to buy into the Big Bang. Now, Big Bang cosmology seems to be the established rule of the way things went. Okay, well, how do you get something from nothing? Stephen Hawking tried that, and his book didn't work very well, Grand Design. People really kind of made fun of that one, but he didn't want there to be a God. In fact, you got to read what some of the scientists said back around 1900 when, for the first time, they were discovering the universe seems to have expanded, which means it had to start. Up till then, they were pretty happy with what they called the steady state theory. It's always been here. But now to have a starting point, there's a guy, I forgot his name, Eddington. He was a very well-known scientist, and he said, the idea of a start to the universe is repugnant to me. I always laugh when I hear that. It's like, what scientist is going to come up with a theory and go, ew? That's not the job of a scientist to say, I don't like this. Well, he didn't like it because he knew the implications. Who struck the match? Who got this thing going? Big Bang needs a big banger. How'd this thing get moving? The universe didn't invent itself. If there's a knock at the door, there's somebody there. The knock didn't knock itself. Okay, any other arguments that you... Well, we'll just move on in a second here. But anything else you'd say for the existence of God? Bill?
Ecclesiastes 3:11. God has put eternity in the hearts of them.
Yeah.
And that's why you have so many religions.
Yeah.
They're looking to fill that glass.
Yep.
Fill it with dirty water.
They fill it with dirty water, yeah. You know, a lot of social scientists, let's say 30 years ago, 40 years ago, they thought once people got more modern, they would be dumping religion. That hasn't happened at all. Now, we're looking at the United States. It's pretty dry here, isn't it? But places like Korea, it's exploding. China, it's exploding. Africa, I say it, Christianity. Christianity is exploding in Africa, exploding in Latin America. I hear that some places are starting to send missionaries over here. How's that for irony? How about these churches? You hear about these worldwide churches like the Episcopalian churches or whatever? They're starting to disassociate from American churches because they've just gone over the deep end when it comes to social issues and all. So you get far better theology outside the United States than in our churches. Yeah, that is a good argument. People know it in their heart that there's a God. Well, what about some of these other things up here? Could you make arguments? So obviously we say we think there's a God. We'll talk in a few minutes about the reliability of the gospel, so let's leave that alone for right now, and the resurrection of Jesus. But you know, I wanted you to think about number 7 up here. All during this forensic faith section we're going to be going through, not just these chapters, but future chapters, Wallace is going to keep coming back to saying, what are you doing? What strengths do you have? Who can you be talking to? What connections have you already made? Which means you really ought to have your own story. People are into stories these days, aren't they? We've kind of lost a lot of intellectual stuff. It's kind of hard to keep people entertained talking about, the start of the universe. But if you tell them your story, either how you came to Christ or what Christ has done for you right now, or miracles you've witnessed or answers to prayer, people are open to that and they can't argue with you because it happened to you. There's a little thin book called Signs and Wonders in America Today, and it just goes all over the U.S. It won't be things that you've heard of from the newspapers because they don't cover stuff like that, but it's amazing, miraculous answers to prayer that people have had. Just awful things that have happened to people, and they've been prayed over, and they've gotten over, and the doctors are just amazed. So you may have a story like that, and if you don't have, if that's not your story, I bet you know other people have had some amazing things happen to them. So you need your story. You have that as part of why you believe Christianity is true. Yeah.
I think we have more of a chance to make a connection with them when we listen to their story first.
That's true.
Because they'll be more willing to listen to what you have to say.
Yeah, exactly.
Fill out where they're at.
Yeah.
What they're interested in, and take it as a jump.
Well, a few years ago, we did a book called Relational Apologetics in our Apologetics class. Michael Sherrard. And Nathan knows something about that. He's working with Sherrard now.
He's my supervisor right now.
He's a supervisor. So isn't that the message that Sherrard says? We got to listen.
Yeah.
We've got to make a connection. We don't go up and start hammering people with information about Christianity. Well, God bless them. These people hold up signs, John 3:16. But I got to believe making a connection is far more powerful. And they get to know you're a real person, and you You show them that, and you find out about them. So that's a terrific, again, a nice thin book. It's called Relational Apologetics. And we went through it. Some of you may remember that several years back. But good book. Okay, let's move on because, like I said, a lot of stuff. But again, if you want more of this information, we've got talks on all these things on the EFCC Apologetics website. Through the church here, you just look for our Apologetics class. What about this? I wanted you to think about this before I put some information up there. Let's say that you have people that don't want to get into that big issue about Christianity, but you show up and you got a Bible in your hands and you say, well, Romans says, or the life of Jesus, is really impressive, and you ought to read through the Gospel of John. They're going to go, Gospel of John? Everybody knows that was written hundreds of years later, and there was a power move by the church to include these Gospels, but they left out a whole bunch of other Gospels. How come they're not in the Bible? So I want you to think about it. I don't want the people in here who already know the answers, because I know that a bunch of you that already know the answers, so just hang on a minute. But could you make a case for the reliability, especially of the Gospels, not necessarily the whole New Testament, because we want to focus on the life of Jesus. So just think now. Imagine you're sitting in a conversation and somebody says, why in the world did you buy into those 4 books? No answer yet. Just think. Just a minute. I want people to think about that. Okay, what are a few things? Jim, you're going to...
Well, one of the things I've heard is that there's about 100 times as many manuscripts of the New Testament as there are any other ancient document.
Okay, bingo. There's one of the things you want to say. What are we talking about? Do we have the originals of Matthew, Mark, Luke, John? The original, are they hanging in the Vatican anywhere? Nope. No. They've just turned to dust. You ever had an old paperback that starts yellowing? And pretty soon you try to open it and the spine cracks and the pages start to... that's not acid-free paper. And so papyrus is the same thing. It just, unless you can get them into caves and put them into jars and seal them and stuff like that, you just don't find those things very often. And so we have copies. Well, obviously, the more copies you got, the better you could recreate the original. Does that make sense? If you had an elderly dying aunt and she wrote you a recipe by hand, kind of shaky handwriting, and then she passes away and you go, I don't know if it says teaspoon or tablespoon, but what if she'd written that same recipe out for 25 of her, I don't know, nieces and nephews and stuff, and you guys all sat down and you put those out. The more copies you had, the better you'd be getting back to the original, I think. Yeah, there's thousands of copies. Somebody once said, if you took the average author of ancient times, you name it, Tacitus or Herodotus or Thucydides or Plato or whatever, the average, because they're kind of thick pieces, the papyrus, but the average stack is about 4 feet. If you just average every old writer from antiquity, you'd have about 4 feet of manuscripts. Do you know what he said we have when it comes to the New Testament, if you put it on that scale? 1 mile. So that's pretty impressive. Yeah, so that's one thing you could argue. We have a ton of evidence that will take us back because we have so many manuscripts. We can figure out what they said. Anything else you would do for the reliability of the Gospels and all? Mike?
And also the manuscripts are close to the actual events. They're not hundreds of years separate.
Yeah. I think we mentioned this last week, Buddha. We don't have anything written about Buddha until like 500-600 years later. That's hundreds and hundreds of years removed from his time. They've got pieces now of John from maybe 125 or so, probably, 30 years, maybe 40 years after he wrote. And now the story is, I don't know if they haven't really released it yet. If you guys ever hear it, let me know. But there are all sorts of rumors that they found pieces of the Gospel of Mark in the 1st century. You know what they've done? Maybe this just knocks me out. I probably have told you this before, so I won't spend a lot of your time. But people that were poor in Egypt, when they buried them, would not get these wonderful, sarcophagus kinds of things and beautiful mummy wrappings and stuff. So people would just kind of paper mache them. They just, anything they had, and it was bits and pieces, and there you go, and into your final resting place. So they've now, of course, they got all these bodies there, and they found out, I think it's palm olive, they just put these masks in a can or something that has some water and palm olive, and they can pull those pieces apart and see what were they using. And the story is, well, it's more than a story. They've actually found pieces of the Gospels that were used. Kind of horrifying thinking about, they took pieces of the Gospel, but you can find them again. That just knocks me out. So we not only have a whole lot of manuscripts, but they go back closer. Homer, it's hundreds of years later. Caesar is hundreds of years later. I mean, all these people, the historians say we can recreate it. We're pretty satisfied that what they say, even though there's hundreds of years till, from that far away from the originals, we feel like we're reconstructing it pretty well. Well, hey, same thing then would apply. They must have a tremendous amount of authenticity when it comes to these copies and the closeness to the originals. Any other thing that you could talk about as far as the reliability of the Gospels?
Archaeological evidence.
What's that, archaeological evidence?
Everything they've ever said as far as what their was at the time, where the shores bordered their only man's world. At times were in disbelief, but later in those
Yeah, there have been some famous historians that have taken Luke, for example, and been very suspicious and gotten done looking at Luke and saying, this guy's a master historian. Now, Eric, what were you going to say?
Well, most of the first century church fathers had sermons. We have copies of the sermons. I believe if you take all of their sermons and extract where they say they're quoting the Bible or the New Testament, you can recreate almost the entire New Testament.
Yeah.
So that means from the, second century, which would be 100 to 200 AD.
Yeah.
You basically have a large number of people who are quoting, the gospel.
Yeah. Isn't that impressive? The church fathers, they'd say, well, as it says in whatever, Matthew, or as it says in Luke. And so you keep those pieces, you can pull all of those together. If you lost all the manuscript evidence, you've got these church fathers. Here are a couple of other things you might want to think about. And this goes with, sorry, what was the name again that's over here? Jeremy?
Yeah.
Okay. What Jeremy was talking about, we have a lot of evidence that eyewitnesses wrote the Gospels, not just people long time later. Eyewitnesses. Things like he was talking about. Luke seems to have gotten all of the names of the various people who were in power in these cities, because every city was like a city-state, and they would not have the same title. Like we have mayor everywhere, but they would have these different names, proconsul, or I don't even know all the terms that they would use, but every city had its own, and Luke got it right. And he got the sailing directions right. He got all sorts of geographical stuff correct. How about John? He says there's that pool of Bethesda. He says there were 5 colonnades. He names it. He says there are 5. He gives it a number. And then in 70 AD, what happens to Jerusalem? Whoa. So if you're going to write this thing after 70 AD, you're not going to know how many colonnades there are. Well, they've been digging it up over the years, and guess how many colonnades they found? John got it right. There were 5. Not 6, not 4. He got it right. There were 5. So there's a bunch of reasons why you can say, we trust these people as eyewitnesses. How about early creeds? Is that a fascinating thing or not? What are creeds? Creeds are little tiny nuggets of truth that early Christians used to use as a way to kind of catechize each other. What are the basics of the faith? And they're all over the New Testament, all over the letters of Paul. In 1 Corinthians 15, I don't have my Bible with me. Do you guys have a Bible? Can you go to verse 3 of 1 Corinthians 15? Steve's got his, Rick's got his. Oh yeah, do you have it?
1 Corinthians 3:15.
15.
Oh, sorry, 15.
3.
If it is 3:15, yes.
No. 1 Corinthians chapter 15.
Oh, sorry.
Okay. Around verse 3.
15, verse 3. For what I received, I passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures.
Yeah. So do you hear what he says? What I received. In other words, he said, I'm not making this up. I got this from the early church. And when did he get it? If you read Galatians, you'll see in there. He got it when he went to the early church fathers, the leaders, the apostles. So he says, I got this thing, and now I'm handing it off to you. That's fancy talk for saying this is a creed that early Christians would say to each other, and now I'm going to give it to you. And you know it's coming up, if you know this part of the scripture, that Christ died, that he was buried, he was raised again, that he was seen by 500 people, and you could go talk to them and stuff like that. That's a creed. They say that creed may go back to the first year after the death of Jesus. Wow. I mean, the Gospels, there is some time that went by before the Gospels are written down. By the way, they circulated orally probably first, and that's not a problem. We don't have the time to talk about that tonight. But you have these creeds that are back to the very beginning of Christianity. And guess what they say? They say the same story that the Gospels say. Jesus died and rose again. The whole message is right there. Nothing got changed over time. Take a look sometime. Just type in, you can do a Google search, just talk about early Christian creeds and Paul's letters. It's fascinating. It's in Colossians and Philippians. Remember there's a poem in Philippians about God thinking it not Jesus giving up all his glory and coming to earth. You know that one? Is it Philippians 2? I think 2? Okay. That's an early creed. That's a song. And Paul's just saying, hey, I like this. Let's use it. He's not saying, I wrote this song. He didn't say that. It's written in a different format. So Paul is reaching out for these old pieces, little nuggets. It's just cool as can be that these things are sitting inside the Gospels. How about outside historians backing up the story of Jesus? We've got more people talking about Jesus than just the New Testament authors. Steve did talk on this a while back. You got what? Tacitus, and Pliny, and Josephus. And none of these people were Christians. Some are really hostile. Some didn't understand it at all. They're going, what are these people? But they told the same story. They said Jesus is being worshipped as a god. This didn't come 300 years later. It wasn't a church council that said, let's make Jesus a god. That would be cool, wouldn't it? This is happening in the first century. They're writing these letters, second century. They're writing these letters and saying, what's with these people? They're treating this guy that started their religion as if he's a god. Yeah, so that goes way back to the beginning. By the way, Bart Ehrman has made a fortune. He's been riding this horse to death, and that's the idea that the Bible, the New Testament stories of Jesus have all these variations inside of them. In other words, one will say Jesus Christ, and another copy will say Christ Jesus. And he gets all upset about that. Because he'll say there are 400,000 differences in the manuscripts, and you go, 400,000? How can you trust anything? Well, is anybody confused if they say Jesus Christ or Christ Jesus? Does that shake your faith? No. How about misspellings? Does that ruin your faith? No?
Well, even now, we still emphasize first name, last name.
Yeah. These are the majority of things. In fact, your Bible, if you go to the story of the woman caught in adultery, it says right there, these are not in the best, earliest manuscripts. It doesn't mean Jesus didn't do it, but it's just some of the early manuscripts didn't have that. So we know where these differences are, and they don't make a lick of difference when it comes to your basic theology. Jesus is always the Christ. He's always the virgin born. He's always the one dying on the cross. He died for our sins. He rose again. That doesn't change. There's not a bunch of verses that say he never rose. And then another copy of a manuscript says, yes, he did. And you go, I don't know. There's none of that. It's just these minor little things. And he runs with that and says 400,000 differences as if you can't trust anything. That's not the case at all.
Okay.
Yeah, Bill?
Back to your slide. Number 2. It's just interesting because in terms of the Quran, after Muhammad died, they had 8 versions that came together. So totally different. They destroyed 7 and did what.
Yeah, do you guys know that story? It was the second or third caliph that did that. He starts getting these reports. What? It says that? What? It says that? And so that's how you get unity in that. You just destroy all the other copies. So, yeah, we don't have that problem. Here's the third one then, and again, I apologize, we're going quickly, but there are complete talks on this that you can go to on the website. It's all in the book if you want me to send it. But what about the resurrection of Jesus? Everything Christianity hinges on the resurrection. It doesn't matter really what Jesus said, does it? I mean, that's not saving you. Oh, I got to be good. I got to do the golden rule. Really? That's going to get you into heaven? We can't do it anyway. We can't live up to our own standards, much less the standards in the Sermon on the Mount. Okay, so the resurrection is the key. So again, can we take just a minute and have you think about that? How do you argue that and I mean argue in a good sense, not getting mad, but how would you talk about the resurrection and get beyond just because I believe it's true, because it's in the Bible, because the pastor talks about it, because I can feel it in my heart. Jesus is alive in my heart. I mean, I'm not making fun of that. That's great. But anything that we can use our brains on. Just a minute. I want people to think about that for a second. Okay, how would you argue for the resurrection of Jesus Christ? Nobody else has been resurrected. I mean, at least world religious leaders. It's quite a claim. Some people say an extraordinary claim needs extraordinary evidence.
I just read 1 Corinthians.
Are you back to 1 Corinthians 15?
Whole chapter.
Yeah. What were you going to say?
Well, I was going to say, I think the first thing is to acknowledge the person who has a problem with that it's normal because it doesn't happen very often.
Yeah.
People who were with Jesus for 3 years, one of them told us he did not see the resurrected Christ, he did not believe until he said, I put my hand, I touched the
yeah.
side and I believe it. That's what happened.
Yeah.
So it's normal that you go.
Yeah.
Come out.
Oh, yeah. So what do we have to do? Cumulative case again. We're going to have to come up with several different ideas. So let's think about these for just a minute. Don't we have to first say that there is a God? I mean, you can't have Jesus rising from the dead unless God exists. By the way, I've always thought that was so odd. People that are quite willing to agree with you that there's a God, and then they get all hung up on miracles. He brings the universe into existence, and he can't create a child born out of a virgin? Why is that a hang-up? Oh, Jesus walked on water. I can't believe that. I think there's a God. What? Does that make any sense? I mean, if there's a God, anything's open. Anything's possible. He can stick his hand into history here. And we're going to talk about inference to the best explanation. That's building a cumulative case, isn't it? We're making an inference. We can't prove it 100%, but we're going to think about other possible explanations, and this will be the best one. J. Warner Wallace talks about we don't want to consider what's possible. We want to think about what's reasonable. In a court of law, how far do you have to prove things? Beyond a reasonable. It doesn't say beyond a possible doubt. I mean, it's possible. I guess you guys walk out of here today and you get hit by a meteorite. Is that reasonable? No. I don't know of anybody that's ever been hit by a meteorite. No, it hit a house one time, but I know that I know has been killed by a meteorite. But it's possible, I guess. Where, stuff's coming into the earth all the time. So he says, no, that's not the standard. What's possible is reasonable. So if you look at the resurrection, it's what's reasonable. We're back to the creeds again. Bill was mentioning that. And then I wanted to take just a minute for this idea of what's called the minimal facts approach. The guy that's pushed this really hard, his name is Gary Habermas, Habermas. He's got a great website, garyhabermas.com. So Habermas says, why don't we do this? Why don't we look at what every reasonably educated scholar in the field agrees, whether they're Christian or not. So New Testament scholars, they don't have to be Christians, they might be atheists, but they're just curious about the New Testament. What do they agree on? And then let's put it on the page here, and then try to figure out what accounts for these things. So almost every scholar that's reasonable and is published in the field and is respected believes Jesus really did die and was buried. Yes, they believe the tomb was empty. They're not saying Jesus rose from the dead. Many of them, they're not Christian, but they'll acknowledge something happened with that tomb business. Notice the third thing they'll say, they won't say the disciples definitely did see Jesus. They'll say, the ones that aren't Christians will say, they believed, the disciples believed they saw Jesus. That's a little more mild, isn't it, than they definitely saw him. Paul and James were converted. Nobody's doubting that. The disciples began teaching this new story in Jerusalem. Nobody's doubting that. And then the followers got rid of the Jewish rites. They're not doing those things that the Jews used to do, the temple sacrifices and stuff, and they've started communion, and they've started baptisms. I mean, things that were very different than the Jews did. So if you put all of this together, try any other theory of what happened to Jesus, and it totally falls apart. Let's try one. It's a conspiracy. The disciples pulled this off. Anything up here that might throw that in for a loop and all? Yeah.
I was just wondering if they agree that Jesus is crucified and buried, and they agree to event. Where's the body?
Yeah, where's the body? So the disciples, what? They hid the body? And then they all went to their deaths. There's never a single sniff or hint at all that any of them retracted their story. And you say, well, wait a minute. People lie and do things all the time. Yeah, they do things for about 3 reasons. Sex, power, and money. How did the disciples do with those 3? They get any girlfriends that create a lot of money out of this thing? No. Power? Oh yeah, a lot of power, huh? Crucifixion and beheadings and impalings and stonings and pushed off buildings and John probably in exile and stuff. It didn't work out very well for him. What were you going to say, Nancy? Oh, I'm sorry. Same thing, huh? What about another theory? The disciples believed they saw him. Hallucinations. That's actually kind of a fairly common theory these days. They hallucinated. Yeah. Who in the world group hallucinates? Nobody group hallucinates. Nobody sits around and they all come up with a hallucination. By definition, is a private experience that people have. That doesn't work. And plus, if you're hallucinating, all you have to do is say, "You guys are hallucinating. Let's go find that body. It's sitting in the tomb. You guys are just hallucinating. Roll that stone away. There he is. Oh, I guess I was hallucinating." End of story. How about Paul and James? Remember, the disciples wanted to see Jesus so badly they hallucinated him. Did Paul want to see Jesus so badly? The guy's out killing and imprisoning Christians. He's doing very well, thank you. He's high up in the Jewish faith. He's got a great future, doesn't he? He's a member of the creme de la creme, right at the top of the group there. And he gave it all up. Why? Why would you give up all that stuff? So you can get stoned and shipwrecked and beaten and imprisoned. And remember, he's done lists of all the things that he's gone through. And you read that and you go, oh, my word. And I complain when I stub my toe. You know, you say, yes?
I would argue that people aren't going to be willing to die for a lie.
That's true. If they know the truth is really there. Now, people will fly airplanes into buildings, and that's a lie, but they don't know it's a lie. I mean, this first generation of disciples knew whether it was a lie or not. Why are you going to go off to your death and know it's a lie? Chuck Colson said, I know conspiracies, they fall apart really fast. Chuck Colson ought to know. He was involved in the Watergate. So he says, these guys were not part of a conspiracy. Think about this, too. Where'd they begin their teaching? Right where Jesus was. If they're getting the story wrong, is anybody going to say, yeah, I'd like to follow that? They're going to say, his body's over there. Are you kidding me? Let's go crack that tomb open. But they get thousands of people. This thing just bursts like a wildfire, and it starts in the very city. I mean, if I'm going to make up a story and a religion and say that I raised people from the dead, for instance, I'm going to go do it in Calcutta or someplace far away. So they'll go, I don't know. Maybe he did, maybe he didn't. It's too far away. But they started it right in Jerusalem. Yeah?
You know, I wonder along those same lines, and starting in Jerusalem, I wonder if people today think about the size of San Diego and Escondido and everything, and they forget that back then that town was super small.
Yeah.
They could have just in 5 minutes walked over the tomb.
Oh, and they knew each other. I'm sure everybody knew everybody. And Paul says there have been 500 witnesses. You know, I'm sure he had a list somewhere and said, go talk to these people. And the followers, what'd they do? They got rid of their Jewishness as much as they could, didn't they? They dumped hundreds and hundreds of years. They dumped all of this traditional stuff. They walked away from it to create something totally new. Why would you give up all of that? You're giving up your heritage in a sense. I mean, you put all these things together, and I think, again, cumulative case, the most reasonable case is Jesus rose from the dead. Something very odd happened in that time period. Otherwise, you don't get all of these things together. Yeah?
I think for me, one of the great proof that something amazing happened is the fact that we're all so scared after the crucifixion and we're all hiding up the room, shaking in their boots and and suddenly they are full of stirring slaughter.
Oh, yeah. Just amazing. Set the whole world upside down. By the way, one other theory that has kind of been discredited now is called the swoon theory, that Jesus really didn't die on the cross, and that they pulled him off, threw him in the tomb, but it was nice and cool, and he kind of revived and got rid of all the bandages and came back, and the disciples said, "Oh, you're the Son of God." I don't think they would say it. You see a guy come dragging in with all sorts of wounds, and he can hardly stand, he's pale, and he collapses. You're not going to say, "Oh, you're the Son of God." You're going to say, "You're one lucky guy. Just sit down, shut up, we'll get you healed up over time." But that doesn't make any sense either, Bill.
Islam says a lookalike.
Oh, that's right, the Islam story. Of course, that's written 600 years later, and we're supposed to believe 600-year time gap.
Beaten up and everything to look like Christ. He had to be beaten up.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, anyway, and again, this is just touching the surface, so I hope you have a chance to dig into any of these things we've been talking about. Let's do this. So Steve's going to be starting next 3 weeks covering chapter 2. So we'll get the information out to you. It's called Targeted Training. And I like this chapter a whole lot. It's 5 steps toward preparing yourself to be a first responder. Remember, we're talking kind of police lingo here. And so being a first responder, getting out into the community, making things happen. So this will take you beyond just the head knowledge we've been talking about tonight. It's getting us out into the community and making a difference. So that's what Steve's going to be doing. Dan's going to come up here for the last part of the class and share with you what he's been doing as far as apologetics go. You know Dan, he's been in our class before. I picked up some new information about him. I didn't know he'd served in the submarine service, so thank you very much for your service on that. Leads the homeless ministry. That's how I know him, because we've talked about that before. And Dan sends me something every once in a while about messages that he's given to these homeless people, and he's using a lot of apologetics. So Steve and I wanted to welcome Dan up here and have him share with us.
Thank you, Gary. Thank you very much. Funny, I was a little nervous about coming in front of and talking in front of all of you people. I talk every week in front of homeless people and everything, but it just seems a little bit different. So if I get anything wrong today, since we're all Christians and we'll spend eternity together, you can complain to me for eternity. How about that? So I wanted to give a little bit of background of where I come from and everything, and you see some of my information here. Like a lot of people, maybe my age, I don't know, but I was an Army brat like a lot of guys. My dad was served in Germany, so I was born out there and raised out there for a while. And then last place he was stationed was in Maryland, so I'm a Baltimore, Maryland guy. And then moved out here with the Navy. But anyway, that's all self-explanatory. I have other things to talk about, so why don't I get to that? I've got a limited amount of time, I think. So my wife and I left. We started coming to the church here at Emmanual Faith about 20 years ago. We had a friend that introduced us, and we just fell in love with Dennis's talks, his teaching. That's something we haven't seen before. I was raised Catholic. I'm sure there's some people in here that would raise Catholic. Completely different, right? Going to a Christian church where you're actually learning straight from the Bible and developing a relationship. I just love that, and hadn't had that before. So that went that way. I got out of the Navy, and of course, right away I went into NASCO shipyard, worked in the shipyard for a little bit. That was a tough job. Kept that to a short job, left there. I actually made more money when I worked at Home Depot later, which was kind of funny. But then I went to, after that I went into wine sales and then beer sales and biotech sales, which is where I am now. I'm a biotech sales rep, and I work out of my house. But meanwhile, the whole time my faith was kind of shallow, not really rooted in anything. It's just kind of a shallow faith, not really giving God a lot of credit for any of that, because I didn't even think like that. I was kind of new, you might say. And then I ended up getting this one of these other jobs that I really enjoyed in the biotech field. But over time, I was laid off 3 different times. And companies going out of business, some of these smaller biotechs just simply wind down out of business. Another company had a big sales force, and they realized, oh my gosh, we have too many salespeople. We have 4 in California. We need to knock it down, that sort of thing. So those are very humbling experiences, And it's then that I think God sometimes, like a talk I gave just the other day, C.S. Lewis said that God shouts to us in our pain, And that might have been a shouting period right there. God pulled me back. And that really strengthened my faith at that point. But still, it was a faith that was based on things that were happening in my life. It wasn't necessarily an apologetics kind of a faith, rooted in truth. I was an accidental Christian, like we talked about last week, I think. So it was the provision there that God was providing for me that encouraged me to want to help others, not to share my faith with others, but just to help others. So with that, I was going to church here at Emmanual Faith, like I said, and I went to one of the community outreach programs they had. Remember, like 2 weeks ago, we had all the tents set up outside of church here. So I went up to one of those tables, and I went to the Donovan prison ministry, and I was like, "Oh, there's a prison ministry. I don't know if I want to do that." So then I went over to the homeless, and I said, "Can I help in some way?" And they said, "Sure, we'd love to help you." Steve Barnhart led the program then, and really nice guy. And that was about 15 or 16 years ago. Every Thursday, they provide a meal and a message and clothes, if necessary, that kind of thing, to the homeless here in Escondido. It's a wonderful ministry. But we were doing it at a church over on 5th and Calmia, a little Mexican, Emmanual Iglesias. And eventually we kind of ran our time with those guys, so we've since moved on. It's tough to find partners, church partners, that want to have 60 or 70 homeless people every Thursday forever. That's our deal when we ask them to do something like that. So we would give a message and a meal to these guys. And I wasn't part of the message team then, or I didn't get involved in giving the messages, but it was a message just about the Bible, stories from Jesus, Old Testament stories, Paul's ministry, things like that. And it was good, but I couldn't help but thinking, gosh, these people are down and out. They're on the bottom rung. They need to hear that God really does exist, and you have a Father in heaven who loves you very much, and wants to see you, can't wait for you to come home. That's the message I thought. So I thought to myself, hey, why don't I give the message? It's only a 10-minute message. There's people sleeping down there, there's people in the back drunk or whatever, so it's not a lot of pressure. And it's funny because I went to that Donovan prison ministry one and asked them. He says, "Yeah, about every 2 months or so, you give about a 45-minute talk." I'm like, 45 minutes? And then you get a new respect for Dennis giving a full talk for 35 or 40 minutes or whatever, But this is just 10 minutes. So it's tough, too, because you got to kind of nail it, for 10 minutes. Anyway, so I would give that message, and it turned out I was pretty good at it, and I put some apologetics in there, like Gary was telling you, and it's fun because there's no program. It's just me and the homeless people giving a talk like this. I do it every 2 weeks. I'm part of a team, and I remember this one time I was back in the back while another guy was giving the talk, and I'm cleaning up a mess on the ground. I can't remember if it was throw up or if it was just spilled food or something. But I remember one of these big guys came up to me and he hugged me and he said, "You know what? I am totally recommitted to my faith because just seeing you clean like this and how humble you are, and then you give the message, it just makes me realize what am I doing with my life? I need to come back to Jesus, and that kind of thing." And then it's funny because I saw him for a couple of weeks more and I haven't seen him since. So it's like that, right? Because these are homeless guys, so they kind of move on. He might be in another state for all I know now, but that doesn't matter because our job isn't to track these people, right? God and the Holy Spirit tracks. It's funny, Gary was talking about how God, I've always said that God doesn't need anyone to help save people. The Holy Spirit doesn't need our help at all. But they kind of need someone to kind of make the case, though, don't they? I mean, they need humans talking to them, and sometimes God sends us. And that's what I talk about sometimes. Sometimes God chooses us and sends us out. So that's what I saw. I got to be careful because I'm rambling. I'm a rambler. I got to watch out. Let's see. I was at work one day and I was talking with my boss about just driving along because I had listened to some podcasts or searched the internet about the young Earth. I don't know if some of you may have heard about that concept. The idea that, hey, the Earth really is about 6,000 years old. Get used to it. That's the way it is, And here's the evidence. So I was throwing around a little evidence to him, and he looks at me, my boss, and he says, "Dan," he's a Catholic, "Dan, evolution's totally real." And I was just totally dumbfounded. I honestly had nothing really to come back at him with because this was before an apologetics class. But lo and behold, I joined the apologetics class soon after that because I was embarrassed by that. So that was interesting. So now what do? I just a list of things that I do now. I read books. Some of the books that we talk about here, The Case for Christ, I finally read that about 6 months ago. It's been all these years, right? 20 years. And I've never read The Case for Christ. That's a staple, I think. And truth be told, a lot of these books have a lot of the same facts in them for apologetics. They're in there, a bunch of different books have the same facts. So it's easy to put that, ingrain that in your mind. And since I'm the average guy out there, I'll read a book 2 times. Funny, once about 6 months ago or so, I was reading a book and I was like, "Boy, this is really familiar." And then I think it took me to get halfway through the book to realize I think I read this before. So it really does get ingrained in my mind, though. That was kind of funny. But and then another thing I do is I make some flashcards. Flashcards is nice because like we talk about, you can pull some of these things out, like some of the things that Gary shows so easily on the board. Well, I'm the average guy, and I'll forget 9 of those out of the 10, and especially when you're in a conversation, right? When you're talking to somebody, the pressure's on. But flashcards, you use flashcards when you're young, they work awesome. My 2 daughters are in college, and I've always talked about flashcards, and they always said, "Dad, nobody does flashcards anymore." But when they started getting back into flashcards, now my daughter has stacks of flashcards for her classes because they work like a champ, Anyway, so that's that. Just giving a couple different examples of some of the flashcards. And, actually God's design could be a flashcard. Popular Roman writings, like you guys just listed off really quick names of some of the Roman writers out there. That would be a flashcard, right? Because that's good for people to know. A lot of people don't realize that that Jesus is referenced and the way is referenced in some of the old original writings in the Roman writings and so on. The creation of the universe, the creation of people, cells, DNA, the flagellum motor that we talk about, things like that. I love Dylan's idea last week. Remember, Dylan was here, and he talked about going to YouTube and having a private conversation with somebody on YouTube that you see in a discussion board, pulling out one name and say, "Hey, would you like to talk about something like this?" and have an answer. Because that's kind of neat, because it's low risk, it's a conversation, and that person can challenge you. You can take your time in getting back to them. I thought that was a great idea. I watched debates. Remember that Bill Nye the Science Guy and the Ken Ham debate? Did you guys see that about, what was that now, 2 years ago maybe? It was a little embarrassing, I thought. Bill Nye the Science Guy, and remember, his goal is to teach children that there's no such thing as God. All you have is this life, and then afterwards you take a dirt nap. That's Bill Nye's plan for teaching children. It's beautiful. But Ken Ham was the one up against him, and Ken Ham talked a lot, and I'm not talking bad about Ken Ham, don't get me wrong, but he was talking about how the Bible is wonderful. We need to read our Bible more, and the Bible is truth and things like that. And I'm like, where's the facts? Where's the science, Ken Ham? Because you're going up against Bill Nye the Science Guy. So it was a little bit of a letdown. I don't know if a lot of people agree with that, but that was my thought. But those are fun to do. Anyway, as I developed, and I'm coming near the end of my little thing here, as I developed these strengths, it emboldened me here in this apologetics class. And I think that's what apologetics does. It gives you, it fortifies your faith and strengthens you to go out there and make a case. Especially if, like, for example, if you use the flashcards and you have those right at the tip of your tongue, ready to go. But it's interesting because we've learned now, build a relationship first and then get into some of the facts. I think that is key. Anyway, so what I did this past spring, one way for myself to get out there, Gary introduced a member of our class here, Nathan, who was really heavily into, Nathan, I believe he was the president of the pro-life club at California State University, San Marcos. Yeah. And that was neat because he came up here and talked a little bit about that. But one of the organizations that he was familiar with was CBR, Center for Bioethical Reform. And so those guys had an event coming up, and I figured, well, you know what? It's an event that, everybody wants to march in a pro-life rally. But none of us kind of really do it. Maybe if I ask for hands, there might be 1 or 2 people here. You know what I mean? Everybody wants to do it, but nobody really does it. Well, he had an event coming up, and it was at the college campus, and I figured, I'm going to go to this darn thing. And it wasn't one of those where Tuesday night comes, and you're like, geez, I've already taken a bath, I'm in my pajamas, I ate too much, stuff like that. I got in my car and I went and I parked in the garage, walked across campus, and there, right in the middle of the campus, are these big 20-foot boards, that they put together with huge pictures, graphic abortion pictures. 3 panels of them. I think they even had a 4th and a 5th panel on the side, and they put them all together, and then at night they take them down. That's very controversial, but right there in the middle of the campus. So I went there, and there's big fence around, a big metal interlocking fence. There's cameras that are taking photos and stuff to make sure nothing happens. And I kind of, very intimidating, by the way, but I received training from the group about a week before. Here's the questions that are going to come up. Here's some of the answers that we have. Don't do anything physical, things like that. And so I stayed off to the side like this, And it's funny because at that age, I kind of look like some of these guys' fathers, Since no one's going to come up and assault me or anything like that. I'm your dad. What do you, And but it was low key and it was nice. But what really, really got me was that when I was listening to the pros over here, and by the way, there was only like 4 or 5 pros over here, in Nathan's group. There wasn't a lot of people that help out on these kinds of things. And as a silent offshoot, I should mention to you, which I wrote down, volunteer. If you guys ever want to do anything, volunteer somewhere. You'd be surprised. I always tell my kids this, volunteer. You'd be surprised how many people don't volunteer for things. Like at this homeless thing, we have people who volunteer. We have a lot of people now because we're at a different church. We don't have as many homeless. But you'd go sometimes, there'd be 3 people there that night to feed 70 homeless people. So we grab some of the homeless guys. You'd be surprised how many people don't volunteer sometimes. That's just an aside. But anyway, what really surprised me was all these things that came up with these abortion kids coming in, and some of them were dropping the F-bomb and things like that. But it was just questions back and forth. But so many of the questions were exactly what I learned in the training the week before, and it was like the same, I don't know, I'm keeping it simple, but it was like the same 8 questions. Over and over and over. Somebody new would come up, yeah, well, what about? And it's like, he's already answered that like 7 times in the last 10 minutes, So it was easy. It's easy. A lot of this stuff is really intimidating, but it doesn't have to be, So a lot of times you just got to get out there and take the risk. And then in closing, I will say that I was preparing a talk last week, and Gary got involved a little bit. It was a talk on irreducible complexity. We've talked about that, right, with the mousetrap and everything. Mousetrap isn't a mousetrap until all the pieces are assembled, and it's a mousetrap. Well, in the human body, you have the eye. The eye's not an eye unless it's made as an eye. It doesn't evolve slowly into an eye, and that's our claim that we were boldly made by God. And so in order to get a little bit more information from my talk, I went to the dark web. That's the new word right out there, the dark web. And the dark web was saying that they were debunking it, saying it's ridiculous. What really happened, and I found this fascinating, and it scared me, but I found it fascinating. They said, no, in early animals, there was light-sensing cells. A couple light-sensing cells and he's making the case. I'm reading this. I'm like, I thought there was irreducible complexity. There's light-sensing cells. Light-sensing cells got together, and then they sort of formed a little bit of a cup because the light-sensing cells could tell if there was a predator over there or a predator over there. And so then eventually that cup deepened, and then a lens went over top so that the light-sensing cells could form a focus through the lens. And now that's how you have focus coming and that sort of thing. And I was frustrated. I was like, oh my gosh, everything is just falling apart right here on the dark web. And so I emailed Gary and said, Gary, help me out. I'm preparing a talk. And Gary sent me a couple links. I was able to find a couple more links. And what I found, which strengthened me, was that there's other smarter people who go, that's ridiculous. There's no such thing as light sensing. What do you mean light sensing cells? Scientists. There's a book out there called Darwin's Doubt, I believe. And it's one of those really thick books. I started reading that. Couldn't read it. Too deep, too sciencey, you know what I mean? And they're for our side. So I guess what I can say there is that whole irreducible complexity argument is still a strong, strong argument, but there's always going to be people who try and debunk things like this, and they have no legs to stand on. It's like the guys at the CBR rally. It's the same dumb 8 questions over and over again, So some of these guys that are intimidating and scary, totally wrong, totally wrong. So what I would say is that apologetics has taught me to be more critical, makes sense, to listen to ideas more clearly listen and reason like we talked about, and to ask more thoughtful questions and pay more attention to creation news that you see. There was something, just one little note, there was something this morning in the news that said in Galapagos, the Galapagos Islands, they found a turtle that was not there anymore, extinct. But they found that when they collected samples from another island near the Galapagos Islands, they found other DNA that was similar, and they think part of it was coming from that original that was extinct. So they're going to be able to reintroduce that turtle back into the Galapagos Islands where Charles Darwin was. And they said it's not going to be 100%, but we're going to introduce it back in there. I'm thinking, oh my gosh, you people are going crazy here, you know? So people just go off on the deep end. And so I listen for things like that now because of the Apologetics class. That's all I have.
Thanks, Dan. Okay. Well, I hope you can stick around, and we have cookies sitting there, thanks to Rick and his wife. So still got some cookies. All right, so help yourselves if you have to go. What's that?
I eat them, so I know.
Yeah. Anyway, thank you all for coming out. Next week will be Steve, and it's showing up on the FCC page for Facebook, so these talks. So if you have a friend that says, what do you guys do there, just send them there and they can watch it. Anyway, I'll pray for us. Father, I thank you for this class. I thank you for Dan. I thank you for all the people that are making a difference and sharing with the non-Christians, sharing with those who have questions, and making their faith real, making it, giving themselves confidence as they go out, making it clear, getting rid of the underbrush and all the stuff that gets in the way, so people really know what your message is. And so I pray that you bless the people as they go about the rest of the week, and I thank you for the church that's provided us the place and the time, and for the leadership of this church, and pray this all in your Son's name. Amen.